Hi, this is Beth at Nana's Cool Cottage. Today we're going to be working on a cute little grocery sack bag. Here in Colorado we have gone bagless, so this has become kind of an important thing here in Colorado. And of course we're a quilt store, so who wouldn't want to have fun fabric quilt bags? It would just be so much fun. And so this is one that we made before, and it has cute little sloths on it, and it's perfect for you could probably get 2 gallons of milk in it, but I don't know that I'd want to carry 2 gallons of milk in any one bag. But it's a good little bag, and depending on how you do your seams, it'll just make it a little bit extra stronger. And we're going to use French seams today, so don't stress out over that if you haven't done them before. Super, super easy. Great for pillowcases too. So today we are doing a bag. It's a free pattern from Moda and Ruby Star Society, and so I'm going to be able to give you the dimensions and stuff that we're cutting. And this, at a minimum, needs about 3/4 of a yard, so 27 inches. And if you have a directional fabric, I would go maybe 2 extra inches, just to make sure you can get that design where you want it. And if you're going to pre-wash your fabric, then maybe an extra inch, at most 3. And if you don't get it to the exact dimensions, that's going to be okay. This is a very versatile pattern, and if it ended up as the body ended up like 19 by 19 instead of 19 by 18, or you ended up even 17 by 17, it's still going to be okay because it's so versatile. If by some chance you don't have 27 inches of fabric, you could piece maybe fat quarters together or scraps together, make like a solid piece of fabric, and then cut your stuff out, and that would work well too. Okay, so today I am going to be using these cute little campers. I love to camp. We usually tent camp though, but these are just so bright and colorful, and who can go wrong with campers? So today, out of 27 inches, what I have done, if you look at the pattern, it's going to call for cutting the handles. Let me get this right here. You cut the handles first, and they tell you to cut them at 3 3/4 by width of fabric. So if you laid your fabric down and you had your raw edges at the ends and your salvages are touching each other, so you have a nice fold, and you were to cut from the fold all the way over to the salvage, that would be your width of fabric. Oftentimes it's WOF on a pattern, which is what they have here. And they call for 3 3/4. I have cut mine at 4 inches just because it was easier. I didn't feel like getting down to the 3/4, and I had enough fabric, and I had planned for that to begin with. And so you're going to cut those 2 handle straps. You're going to set them to the side, and then it's going to tell you to cut 2 rectangles from the remaining fabric. It's going to be 18 inches wide, and so it's actually saying the remaining yardage, you're going to cut 1 19-inch width of fabric strip, and then from that you're going to cut 2 rectangles that are 18 inches wide. So again, if it ended up 18 by 19, 19 by 18, 18 by 18, it's all going to work out just fine, whatever you have. I wouldn't cut off an inch just to get it to the exact size that they call for. And plus we're going to do French seams, so you're probably going to lose maybe an extra 1/2 to 1 inch anyways, so a little bit bigger is always better. We love the French seams because it encases the raw edges nicely, and it just looks so nice. Okay, so I have already cut my pieces out, and we are going to start with the handles. So I have, for the sake of time, already created my handles. Let me get this up so you can see this. So you can see that I have some stitching here, and I'm going to show you in a sample how I folded this. And I like to do extra top stitching on my handles just because they take a lot of wear and tear, and I feel like it makes it last a little bit longer. So this is a 4-inch piece of fabric, and it's just a mini little piece. It's just a sample made out of a beautiful batik. I love bright colors, and so I had to choose something bright. And the pattern doesn't call for it, but even on my handles, I have put just a lightweight fusible interfacing. It can be whatever you have on hand. If you had, say, fusible fleece, you could use it. Probably cut it smaller than it calls for. I think I would probably do a 1-inch strip, instead of doing it on the whole thing. And so in this case, what we have done is we have folded it in half, matching up these raw edges right here, And I like to spray mine so I get a nice sharp crease. And what we're doing is we're creasing down this edge here. And then we open it up and that becomes our guideline. And then we take one edge and we fold it in almost to that center line, and probably a scant 1/8 of an inch from that center line. And then I do the same on the other side. So you can see I have just a tiny little gap in between there that altogether probably comes out to a hefty 1/8 of an inch. And I find if I get it too much closer, I tend to overlap and then I end up with extra bulk in there, and I don't want that. So I'm just keeping it about an 1/8 of an inch from each other. And then we're gonna fold that in half, and I'm gonna line up these folded edges so that I can get them as nice as I can. So if I was doing it on my ironing board, I would lay it down, I would get my edges matched up nicely, and I would start ironing, and then I would get the next section so it lines up nicely and move my iron, and then just keep working my way down so that I have the entire thing. And then I like to use clips when I'm ironing straps. So as my iron is sitting on top of my piece, I'm going to, as I move my iron, I'm just gonna clip this just a little bit, and then I'm gonna move my iron a little bit more. I'm gonna add some more clips, and then just keep working my way down. And that way, as it cools, it's held in place and then it stays there really nicely. And these are clover clips, which we love. They're not really great for piecing, say, blocks of a quilt together, but for heavier stuff like this, they're fantastic. And they come in, this is an assorted little multicolor pack with 10 in it, and then you can get boxes of like 50 also. And then they come in bigger, they come in smaller, and they're lots of fun to use. Plus lots of color. And color always makes everything happier, right? Okay, so that's the handles, and so we're gonna skip through that. And on the handle, they tell you on the second page to, at a minimum, you're going to start on the side that has the 2 folds, and you're gonna stitch. And they call for it to be, I thought it said on here somewhere about an 1/8 of an inch, and that's what I would do. I would start on the folded side, and I would stitch it maybe a scant 1/8 of an inch from that outer edge. And then I like to go to the other side, and I do the same thing. And then depending on how much top stitching you like to do, you can put 1 down the middle. I think I've done probably 5 on this, and but that's totally up to you how much you want to do. But at a minimum, I would probably do 2 on the outer edges. And then on the folded edge, you're going to want to do it close enough so it secures it, so there's no gaps going in there. Okay, so the next thing it calls for, excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of water. All this talking makes my mouth dry. Okay, so next I'm going to take my rectangles here, and because I have directional fabric, I am going to go, I'm going to line them up nicely, and I'm going to go down to the bottom, and I'm going to make sure that my bottom edge is lined up nicely straight across the bottom here. And I'm going to take my friction pen. We love friction pens here because they are heat erasable, and some pencils, when you iron them, they become permanent. Or if you mark them, the ones that fade by themselves, if you don't do it right away, you come back and your markings are gone. But we love the friction pens. They come in a skinny felt tip, a fat felt tip, and then this is the ballpoint. And the ballpoint is my favorite because I can sew on a skinny line straighter than I can on a wide line. So I go super skinny. And they come in all sorts of colors. Some people get a little frustrated with them because if you're using a dark fabric, when you heat erase the line, then it leaves a white line. And if it's visible, what we do is we use Best Press. And we just squirt it on there. Best Press is a light starch, comes in several different smells or even unscented. And when you put the Best Press on, spray it on that line, then it disappears. And then you iron it and, excuse me, you iron it and then the whole thing goes away. And if another complaint is that people are afraid that line is going to come back if it gets cold. You know, we live in Colorado, so it's cold here a lot. And but we tested it in the freezer, where we erased all the lines with the best press, stuck it in the freezer. I forgot it actually. I was supposed to take it out after 20 minutes, came back like 3 days later, and the lines were still gone. So it's a very it's a great product, and I love it when I'm doing bias strips for, say, a binding. I just put a little bit of best press on there, makes them just a tiny bit stiffer, but it can still go around corners. It's still very manageable. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, it calls for a 3-inch corner on the pattern. And because I am going to do French seams, I'm actually going to go a little bit smaller. So I have this Quilter Select 2.5-inch cute little ruler here, great for making little charm packs. If you want to make your own charm packs, like say you are a pre-washer like I am, and you want to make your own so that you don't have to buy unshrunk fabric, then you can make your own. It'd be a little bit tedious to do, but totally doable. And one thing we love about Quilter Select, you can see it's a little bit yellow. It has this stuff on the back, and so most rulers, let me do this where you can see it. So this is the shiny side, and this is what most rulers are like. You can push them and they slide. So when you're doing a long cut, they tend to move, and then you lose fabric. But the Quilter Select, now I'm turning it over to the anti-slide side, and you can see I can move my whole fabric, but the block itself doesn't move, and it works just as well on the long ones. And they're a little bit on the pricey side, but so worth it, because I can cut fabric and I don't end up, you know, my ruler moving and sliding 1/8 of an inch, and then I lose that whole section. I've got to flip it over, I've got to re-straighten it. This way it's one and done. I absolutely love the Quilter Select rulers. So going back to my corners, I need to box my corners on this project. So I am going to put this, I need to get this in the, where you can see it. Ooh, let's see, which way am I going here? There we go. Okay, so you can see I have my cute little Quilter Select ruler down here. I'm gonna use my friction pen or whatever you have. Chalk would work, any kind of a fabric pencil, and I'm just marking that corner. And you know what I think? What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a couple pins in here, because I'm sliding this back and forth. I don't want it to become separated and get too big on me. So I'm going over here to my right corner, marking this, and I'm going to put another pin in here. This is another one of my favorite products. It's these magic pins, and they are very fine. I absolutely love them. The tips are fine, the whole shaft is fine, and then the handle is also big enough that you can grab it. So if you have any kind of like shakes or anything, these are fantastic to be able to pick it up. And then even if you don't have the shakes, it's just so much easier to get a hold of. You can iron them, and the handle doesn't melt. And I don't know about you, but I sew over pins. I know that sometimes that's a big no-no in some people's world. My philosophy is that we don't sew over pins unless we have to, and there's a whole bunch of reasons to sew over pins. So what we do is we buy fine pins so that we can sew over them. This pin is going to bend before my needle breaks. When I'm sewing over these, I have never had a needle break on one of these, where I find that the pins that have the cute little pretty heads tend to have a shaft that's big and chunky, and so when your needle hits it, then the needle breaks before the pin does. These will bend, and then if they get bent, you unbend them. I have a box that I have been using for, I don't know, probably 2, almost 3 years at home, and I just unbend them if they happen to get bent, and they're still going. They stay sharp, and they do a beautiful job. So going back to our corners, now that I have marked my 2.5-inch corner, I am going to go ahead and cut it, and I need glasses here. I always cut straighter when I have glasses on. I find I think better when I have glasses on. So here at Nana's, we do lots of bright and colorful things. So remember to check us out on Facebook. We also have a website that shows our products. Not our products. We have some products on there, very limited basis, but our classes are on there, and on Facebook, and a little bit on Instagram. You can see our box opening. So every time we get a new box of fabric and Nikki does a box opening, and she's really great and does a great job on videos. Okay, so moving that stuff out of the way because I'm gonna have to iron. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we are going to pin the sides and the bottom. So I'm going to take pins. I don't like to over pin, but I like to pin at least a little so that it stays together and it's not gonna shift on me. There's nothing worse than sewing, you get done, and then your fabric shifted and now you got one edge that's shorter than the other. And if you have a deep enough seam allowance, that'll make up for it. But I like to prevent seam ripping when possible. Not my favorite thing to do. Okay, now you'll notice that I have wrong sides together. Typically when we sew almost anything, we do right sides, pretty sides together, we sew the seam and then we flip. And that is what the pattern is telling you to do. You're gonna put wrong sides together and you're gonna sew that seam allowance. But in our case, because we want to do French seams, we're putting wrong sides together. And I have pinned, and now I'm going to, the seam allowance is probably a 1/4 inch on this. And no, it says seam allowance is a 1/2 inch unless otherwise noted. So that's a pretty hefty seam allowance. So that gives you lots of wiggle room. So what we're gonna do is we're going to sew initially at a hefty 1/8 of an inch. If I have stitching that's gonna show, then I make sure that my thread matches. But if it's something like this where I really don't care, then I'm gonna just use up whatever I have. It's a good time to use up some bobbins or some thread that's running out. I'm gonna stitch at about a 2. On my machine, a 2 is pretty small, so I like to go with about a 2 1/4. And I'm gonna grab something. My hands tend to run dry, so I like to use one of these gloves. And it's not dirty from, it's not dirt, that's color from fabric because it's been used so much. Okay, so I back tacked at the beginning. In this case, I don't need to sew over my pin, so I'm gonna go ahead and pull it. And I'm going to back tack at the end also. I like to clip my threads as I go. Just get them out of the way. And you can see that this is, you see that? I'm not sure you can. Let me see if I can get a little closer here. I don't know if it's going to focus for us. So I have probably a scant 1/4 inch or a hefty 1/8 of an inch. Smaller than our usual seam allowance because we're going to flip it and sew it again, which is what's going to make our French seam. So if you're ever watching one of our open the box videos and you see some fabric that you just can't live without, give us a call. We would happily put it in our whole drawer if you're local, or if you want to call and pay over the phone. If you want to pay over the phone, we will ship it to you also. We ship to some pretty far distances. And we try to get it in the smallest package we can and keep shipping costs to a minimum. We don't inflate our shipping costs. Okay, so I'm doing the bottom also. And I'm still back tacking at the beginning and the ends. Okay,
I know, I'm just very careful.
so now you can see I have the sides and the bottom sewn at that scant 1/8 of an inch, or sorry, hefty 1/8 of an inch, scant 1/4 inch. Now I'm going to move my makeshift ironing board here into video view, and I'm going to flip this inside out. And you can see I have my corners. That's normal because we cut the corner out, and then that's what's going to allow us to box a corner. Okay, so now I'm going to iron, and ironing is essential when you're doing French seams because you need the precision, and you need to be able to just have that sharp edge so you have a guide. And when I iron this, I'm going to try and get that seam right in the center. Sorry, I'm a finger licker. Like I said, my fingers tend to run dry. So if you don't like to lick your fingers, you can have a little cloth that is sitting there by the side. Okay, now I'm going to take a pin and put probably 3 pins in here just to hold that seam right where I want it. I find that if I put too many pins in a project, it just takes that much longer to take them all out. So I try to put enough, but not an overwhelming amount. Okay, so you'll notice that we now have it right sides together. So this time, when I stitch down the side and the bottom, I'm going to do it a hefty 1/4 inch because I want it to encase that raw edge. And I should have mentioned, before you fold your project right side out, if your fabric is frayed a little bit, because sometimes it gets those strings that kind of stick out. If you have any long strings, cut them off, because if you don't cut them off then and then now you stitch over them, you're going to have to go back and cut them then. So it's easier just to make sure that your edge is nice and clean. And then we flip it, do right sides together. You see in here, got the pretty sides on the inside and the wrong side is on the outside. And so now I'm going to I'm still going to go ahead and use my 1/4 inch foot. I can adjust it a little bit on this machine so that my needle is going to go as far as it can to the left. If you have one of those oval openings and your needle can go farther than center, set it far enough over that you're going to encase this whole seam. I find that if it doesn't, and this is going to be pretty close, I think I'm going to go ahead and change feet here. So the 1/4 inch foot is kind of funny because I fought using it and thought, oh, I don't need that. I can make it work just fine without it. And then Nikki one day was like, oh, just try it. And I did, and I loved it. Now I can still mess up a 1/4 inch with it. I have to pay attention. And if I'm doing something like a binding, I still go back and check. And if I'm scant, then I go back and I re-stitch it so that I'm farther in. I don't like to rip seams, so if I can get away with just stitching a new seam and it moves it a little bit farther in, then I go ahead and leave the old seam. Nobody's going to see it when we're done. Okay, so that gives me a little bit more. I like that better. So I'm still at about a 2, and I'm using the edge of my foot on the folds as my guide. Good time to practice sewing straight too. Because you know, when we're quilting, the straighter we sew, the better the products. Okay, so that was side number 1. Go into side number 2, and I'm going to back tack again at the beginning and the end. I'm removing my pins as I sew because this is an easy project to not have to sew over. If you have a young sewer in your life that is looking to kind of build some skills, this would be a great project for young people. Teach them to sew straight, teach them right sides together, teach them French seams, teach them handles. So now I have the sides and the bottom stitched again, and I'll show you the magic. When we open this up, you can see I have a nice clean edge on the inside, and then out here on the inside, it's all encased. So there's no raw edges, I don't have to overstitch it, it's not gonna fray on me, and it looks really nice and impressive. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna box our corners, and boxing corners is super, super easy. If by some chance you did not cut 2 sides, but say you just folded it over and so that one side has raw edges and the other side has a fold. Excuse me, where's my friction pen here? There we go. Let's say that this was a fold and I didn't need to do the French seam on this one, then I would just take my friction pen and I would just mark the edge of that fold. Because when we do boxed corners, we need to have two lines to match up. Okay, so I am taking, in this case, I am taking my bottom seam and my side seam, and I'm gonna pull that boxed corner the other direction so that those seams match up. Okay, we're gonna do that one more time. So if I have it flat like this, I'm gonna reach inside, I'm gonna grab the corners that I cut and pull them to the side, kind of like your kids when they would, you know, pull their mouth out and make funny faces. That's what we're doing here. We're changing the direction. And we are going to need a couple pins here. Oh, this would be a perfect place for forked pins. I'm going to line up those 2 seams, and then I'm going to take my seam allowances. Let me get this so you can see it here. I have a seam allowance on the bottom and I have a seam allowance on the top, and I'm going to make them go opposite directions, and that's called nesting. And then I'm going to put a pin right down the middle here. If you have forked pins, this is a perfect place to use a forked pin. And then we just smooth it out so that this lays nice and flat. And you can tell how square your boxed corners are by how well this lays. Oh, Nikki's gonna grab me some forked pins here. Oh, look at that, sweet, thank you. Thank you very much. So these are my favorite forked pins. These are by Clover. These are also very fine, so when you sew over them, you're not gonna break a needle. And these are by Clover, and they come in probably a 50 pack. So if you were using, say you were putting blocks together in a quilt and you had 9 blocks going across, well, you're gonna have 8 seams in there that you would need to nest with the next row. So you don't use a whole lot of these, but I tell you what, these are a game changer in my book. Even I can nest seams and make them turn out nice. So what we're gonna do is I'm lining up those center seams here. Get this where you can see me. And I like to do this on something hard so I can feel it. So when I nest the seams and I put my bottom seam going one direction and my top seam going another direction. And when I feel it, there's no gap in between there. If there is, pull those seams closer together. And so I'm going to just take my forked pin and I'm going to put it above my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to poke it back out below. And because we're going to do French seams on this seam also, I'm going to do that scant 1/8 of an inch. So we're going to do the same thing on the other side. We're going to take this corner, I'm going to reach inside, we're going to pull them apart. If by some chance you were using a fold instead of 2 raw edges that you had sewn, you're just going to take that marking and you're going to line it up the same as this. And I'm going to take another forked pin, lay this on the table. I'm going to feel, make sure my seams aren't on top of each other and there's no gap in between. I'm going to put it above my seam allowance and above my stitching line, and then below my stitching line. Now when I sew these, I'm going to back tack at both the beginning and the end. And you can, hopefully you can see that this forked pin has a little bit of an angle on it so you can get a hold of it. I'm going to leave that forked pin in and I'm going to sew right over the top of it. I don't really need to sew over these other two, so I'm going to go ahead and pull those out. Okay, so I am moving my needle as far to the right as I can. And I'm using the edge of my foot on my raw edge of that corner so that I have a scant 1/4 inch. And I'm just going to take something sharp because the lip, I'm going to sew across the lip and it's going to try and push up. So I'm just going to take my scissors and push that down until I get over it. I'm sewing right over the top of my forked pin. Back tacking at the ends. And I'm going to pull my forked pin out, put it somewhere safe. And then I'm going to do this other side. Now when I sew these, I'm making sure that I know, I'm kind of pulling this tight here, making sure I know where all my fabric is. If you sew it down on top of something, some other part of the bag, you're going to have to rip it out. So you're better off knowing where it's at to begin with. And I got my forked pin upside down. I didn't pay attention to that. But I could still sew over it, no problem. Back tacking at the ends. I tend to break some of the rules. I back tack even when I'm quilting. Even if I'm sewing blocks together, pieces together, I still back tack. Okay, so you can see I have my corner sewn there so that when this bag is in its bag form, you'll be able to see the bottom here and then the side because we've created that boxed corner. So now I'm going to turn this. Oh, I just did that wrong. Whoops. Guess what? We're ripping. Actually, you know what I think I'm gonna do? I'm gonna cheat a little because I don't mind my bags being a little bit wider. Okay, so can anybody guess what I did wrong? We're doing French seams. I should have done wrong sides together first. So in this case, since I have a scant seam allowance, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut it off. If you're picky about how big your corners are, then you're going to want to rip those seams if you just followed me. Hopefully you didn't. Okay, so I cut those off. Okay, I'm going to turn this right side out. And we're going to do that all over again. I am still going to nest my seams. It's just the nesting is going to be on the inside. My apologies if you just followed along and did that wrong, right along with me. And I think I am, for the sake of time, I'm just going to not do my extra pins. Now, one thing I do want to pay attention to is on my bottom seam here, my seam allowance is going to the right. So when I do this other side, I want to make it go the same direction so that that seam on the bottom doesn't flip in the middle. Okay, now resewing, back tacking, same stuff. For this bag, back tacking is going to be very important because you're going to put stuff in this bag and you don't want those seams to come apart. When you buy bags at some stores, which I shall not name, there's large stitches and they might look nice, but they're basting stitches and it makes for a weak bag. And I tend to pack the kitchen sink when I pack my bags. And so my bags always end up pretty heavy. And if you have a big basting stitch, then it's gonna fall apart. And nobody wants to spend money and then have it fall apart. Okay. Hey Dee. I'm teaching a class on video.
Oh,
That's okay.
okay, I'll catch you after you're through.
Uh-huh.
Okay. What are you teaching?
I'm teaching the little grocery sack.
Oh.
Okay, so I'm gonna come back to my iron. Depending on where you're from, I feel like that might sound weird. My iron, little twang in there. And I'm going to make this seam nice and straight, just like we did before when we did the French seams. And I'm gonna throw 2 pins on this. Put that where you can see it. Put a pin on each side. And I'm gonna reach inside and I'm just gonna push those corners out, make sure they're nice and square. Now if you don't like big boxed corners on this bag, then you start out with it like we did, smaller than it originally called for. It called for 3-inch, cutting out 3-inch squares. So we cut out 2.5-inch squares. Now granted, I had to cut even more off because of my silliness. And so if you want smaller corners, or like let's say you didn't want the bottom of your bag to be this wide, then you would just go smaller. Say when you cut it at 2.5, it was still too big. Well, then on the next one, cut it at maybe 2, because when we do French seams on boxed corners, it's going to make them bigger because we stitch them twice. Okay, so this time I'm lining up the edge of my foot with the fold on my corner, and I'm going to move my needle back over so that I have a hefty 1/4 inch. Making sure I back tack. You know, everything in life comes down to how OCD you are. So if you are super OCD about your nested seams, then put that forked pin back in there and it'll hold it together nice and tight. If you don't care, then don't do it. If you ever have problems with after you finish stitching and you go to pull your project out and you have 3 threads that are coming out, or it feels really funny, make sure that this steely bob right here is all the way to the top, and you can use your flywheel on the right to roll it to the top, and then when you pull it, you only get 2 threads. Okay, so there we go. Now I have the body of the bag together. And that took us 39 minutes with all of my talking. So without my talking, you could probably get it done in 20. Okay, so there we go. You see my bag here. And my boxed corners at the bottom turn out nice And on the inside, all my seams are encased. And I love that. I don't like raw edges. Okay, so next, grab a drink of water here, excuse me. Okay, so we're going to turn our upper edge here in 1/2 of an inch per the directions. And I am not going to use a ruler. If you wanted to draw a line, you absolutely could. I would draw it on the outside versus the inside so that you can see it, because we're rolling this edge to the inside. And I'm going to do roughly a 1/2 inch. If you're using a thicker fabric, like say an Essex or a canvas, you could use spray a little bit of water on it to help hold it, because like even with the thin fabric, when I iron it and then I take the heat off of it, it still wants to kind of pop back. And then with the thicker fabrics, it's going to do that even more. So even though I'm not not measuring it, I'm still doing it about a 1/2 inch. And if you wanted to pin this or clip this as we went, you could totally do that. And I'm just trying to make mine even. Okay, now the directions call for turning it in 1 inch. So I think for this one, 1 inch would be a little bit harder for me to get even. So what I'm going to do is grab my little ruler and my friction pen, and I'm just going to make a couple markings for the 1 inch. I like this little measuring ruler block. It's easy to work with. And so I'm just kind of marking every probably 4 or 5 inches, just doing a line so that when I fold it, I can make sure I'm getting a nice 1 inch here, because this is my final fold, so I want it to be nice looking. And I'm marking it on the outside so that as I fold it, I can see. And I'm just going to I'm working on the bottom layer here, and as I fold it up, I can see my 1 inch marking there, and then again in the center. So I'm just going to put my iron on top of it. And where's my next line? There we go. So I have a line here in the middle, and I have one over here on the far side. And so I'm just going to get that so it looks nice and even, and then just iron it across. And we are going to sew the handles on before we sew this down. So I'm not going to bother pinning it, because we would just have to unpin it. This iron here runs very hot, so you kind of want to know your own iron and how long you can leave it sitting on the fabric. Okay, so I had enough lines on there that I could get all the way around and still get it looking nice and even. I'm going to go over this outside seam here again, because it doesn't want to lay flat. Okay, there we go. Okay, and I was looking earlier, trying to see what they tell us. Okay, so on the back of the second page, we've got folded over a 1/2 inch, folded over another inch, and then it says unfold. Oh, actually, they have you fold the top edge before you sew it. You could do that too if you wanted to, whichever works for you. Okay, so they have you do those. Okay, I'm looking for the straps. I'm trying to look and see how they tell us to do placement. Okay, so they're not being super clear on where we should place them. So I think what I am going to do is I have my side seams and I'm kind of just finding the center. And I'm gonna mark that with my friction pen on both sides. And then I have a handy dandy, it's a 4.5 inch ruler here, and I'm just gonna mark out at 4.5 inches. And I'm just putting big vertical lines so I know where to place my handles. I'm going to the second side, marking them again. And thinking about this, I probably should have done it farther in, but we'll be okay. Okay, so now I'm going to take my handles. And it doesn't look like, you can see one side has the bottom, one side has the top. So I don't think it's really going to matter. I'm going to take my first one and I'm going to line up the edge with the line I just drew, and I'm going to put 2 on the bottom. Handles tend to wiggle and move, so I'm going to do 3. 2 sticking out and then 1 going across so that it doesn't try to move on me. You can see I have 2 up here and then I have 1 down here. And I'm going to take my handle, and you can see it's facing in towards my bag, and that's because when we stitch it and then we flip it, we want it to be sticking out. So I have the one side pinned, and then I'm going to follow this around so that I don't get my handle twisted. And then I'm going to do the same thing. So on my bag, on my lines here, my line is out here, and I put my edge of my strap lined up with the marking, but I have the handle on the inside, whichever way you like yours. If you aren't sure, then try it on the inside, and if it seems too tight, then try it on the outside. You could also pin this horizontally and then fold it down and pin it so that it's as if it were finished, and see which way you like it. Okay, so 2 sticking out and then my horizontal one. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and stitch. I'm going to stitch across the bottom. I'm going to pull my pins out a little bit so I can sew over them without getting the handles. And since I have them sewn, I'm going to pull those pins out. I believe in sewing over pins, but sometimes Murphy lives in my house, and it can get kind of crazy. So I'm not pressing my luck here with sewing over the pins too many times. So I'm basically basting them in place. So that I can take those pins out. Okay, now here's where it gets a little bit wonky. So what I'm thinking is if we sewed them up there on that line, I'm going to sew them again. We're going to give this a try. I'm going to sew them again on my 1 inch fold, and maybe just below it. I'm thinking that that might help to keep it, when we fold the fabric down again, it might help to keep it in place. And this one is kind of hard to see because I've got yellow, so I'm just going to draw my line in where that fold is, and I'm just going to go a hair below it. And we're going to go back over this and sew an X when we're all done with the fold. Okay, so I'm going to take my pins out now. Now when I fold this, I'm going to fold under the, that 1/2 inch, and then it's going to fold again at the 1 inch. Kind of tries to pucker on me a little. But I can flatten it out so that I'm happy enough with it. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the other side. And I already have the markings. And we know that when we pinned it, now on this one, you can see most of my campers on that side and just a tiny bit of the top showing that one. So I think I want the majority of them showing. We know that we used the handle on the inside of that line. So I'm just putting the 2 pins again. And the horizontal. Following this around, make sure that I get my strap untwisted. Be nothing worse than getting all the way through this and then having it twisted. At that point, I might just leave it. So better to, it's like my dad used to say, measure twice, cut once. And when you don't, it tends to bite you. Okay, so I can see my handle is not twisted. Oh, another thing about the handle was I found that when I cut it with the fabric and then finished it, it was pretty long. So I cut about 6 inches off of my strap. Again, very versatile pattern, so you can totally adjust this how you want. This time, I think I am going to stitch the top one just under that 1-inch line. And then I'm gonna take my bottom pins out and I'm gonna stitch this one and see if I get a little bit better of a fold. Let's test this. Test our little theory here. Take the extra pin out, and if I fold it at the 1/2 inch, and then I fold it again at the 1 inch, I think it's better. I like that. I get a little bit less of a pucker in between the 2 stitching lines. So I'm going to do that again. I am going to sew, and I'm drawing that line because it's starting to fade a little bit. It's hard to see. And I'm stitching just below that 1-inch line. And I'm going to stitch it again, take my pins out, push everything down flat. Oh, and I think I just ran out of bobbin thread. So in projects like this, I like to just use up my bobbins. If anybody's getting on the inside of my bag and looking too closely, then I'll just share with them my theory. It wasn't going to show, so I went ahead and used it up. Because sometimes you get so many bobbins sitting there that you don't know what to do with them all. Okay, so now I'm going to take a handful of pins and I am going to work on folding this. So if you remember, we initially did a 1/2 inch fold, and this time I'm pulling my handles up out of the way because that's going to help me turn it under. So I'm going to turn it under a 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to turn it under the 1 inch. And I'm going to start with my handles because that's going to be the weirdest spot to fold. I've got this makeshift ironing board here, so it's kind of wonky. I'm going to grab some clips. Oops. Grab some clips, and I'm just going to kind of clip over the edge here just to hold it down. So I've got some clips here. And I am going to have to stitch on the bottom, and it wants to flip on me because my handle is so much heavier than the body of the bag. But I would still prefer to fight the handles a little bit than to have handles that are loose and floppy. Okay, so I'm clipping again. And then I'm going to pin on that bottom edge. So this time I'm going to end up using quite a few pins. I'm not going to be fussy about using a whole bunch. And this is the perfect place to use your clover clips if you have them. Okay, so let me position this so you can see maybe a little bit better the second time around here. So I am turning under at that original 1/2 inch seam, and then I'm turning under at the 1 inch that we previously ironed. I'm clipping the top edge. I don't have, if you have those super long clover clips that can reach all the way to the bottom of that 1 inch fold, that would be a good time to use those. And then I'm pinning. So I've got 2 pins down here and then 2 clips up here. So here at Nana's, we love show and tell. So if you ever use our fabrics, please post a picture on Facebook so that we can see it. And I don't know about you, but it's all that show and tell, it's inspiration for me. So hopefully it's inspiration for you too. Okay, so now in between the handles, I'm going to pin, and I'm going to pin the bottom fold, and I think I'm going to go ahead and put one at the top here too. I'm going to flip it over, do our other side. And it might seem kind of odd working with the handles and having to flip it back and forth and just trying to manage it. But this is probably the hardest part. So if you have a young sewer, and they might need a little extra help with this part. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my side seams, and I'm going to pin these, and just laying it on that fold. It's getting hard to get these out of here, so I'm going to just move this out of the way. I'm going to pin my bottom edge, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to pin the top with just one. So I've got like 2 on the bottom and 1 on the top. So we're almost done. Okay, so now I'm going to go and I am going to stitch the bottom edge first, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to stitch the top edge again. And this is like the handle. You can put as many seams in this part as you want, but at a minimum I would do top and bottom. If you're fussy about the thread that shows, this is where you would want to have matching bobbin thread in your machine that's going to match your fabric. And to be extra careful, if you are concerned about that, I would make sure you have the same color in the top and the bottom. I'm going to sew this from the inside. If I sewed it from the outside, this first bottom line of stitching, it would be hard to make sure that I got it on the actual fold, and I want to be kind of fussy about that. So I'm going to have the inside facing up. I am also going to start on the side, and I am going to have my needle in the center. Actually, I think what I'm going to do is on my foot, let me pull this off and show you. On my foot, I've got this wide opening right here, right through here. And so I am going to put the edge of my fabric on this inside little part of my foot. And that groove runs all the way down the foot, and I'm going to use that on my bottom fold so I get a nice straight line. And it just gives me something to follow. If you're not sewing straight, it's probably because you're not following a very good guide. So just find whether it's the edge of the foot on the edge of the fabric, or maybe a groove in the foot on the edge of the fabric. Find something that you can follow. and then go that way. And you'll find that that'll help immensely. Okay, so I'm just going to stitch all the way around. I'm at about a size 2, which is a nice securing stitch. Okay, when I get to the handle, it's going to be weird. So I am going to leave my pin in to hold it. And you'll find that when you come to something thick, that it's hard. The machine has to get, the foot has to get up over that bulk. And unfortunately, I don't have anything. You can use like a machine package. Here's a piece of cardboard, but I don't want to fold that.
You need a hump jumper?
I do.
Oh,
Nikki's gonna get us a hump jumper. That almost sounds wrong, doesn't it? So I think in this case, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this excess fabric and I'm gonna fold it in maybe halves. And I'm gonna put it underneath the back of my foot. And then that way, the foot, thank you, and we'll use that next. We've got 3 more of these to do. I'm gonna slide this up underneath the back of the foot, and what it does is it takes my foot from being at a steep angle to leveling it out, and then it's gonna sew nice stitches. I'm gonna make sure that I back tack on my handle. This is where the majority of the stress is gonna be. So I'm gonna back tack pretty much across the whole thing. I'm just doing it in halves. Okay, so now we're going to try this hump jumper. So we're going to pull this as close as we can to our hump, which is the handle. And then I'm going to take this and stick it underneath here. And the cool thing is you can see it has 2 grooves. So I am going to slide this, and it's kind of like using a ramp. If you were putting a trailer on a car on a trailer, it's exactly what it's doing. It's allowing my foot to just slide right up that hump. And then the stitches stay the same length, because if you try to do it without, you get those little tiny stitches, and then finally it gets up there, and then they even out, but this way they stay nice. And you notice I took the glove off. I have to pull the pins with my left hand, and I can't get them very well with that glove on. Okay, make sure you know where all of your fabric is to include your handles. No point in sewing over stuff and having these ripped seams. Oops, where'd my hump jumper go? Oh, there it is. Okay, so now we're going to use this again. This really is a very handy tool. And most sewing machines, oh, and look at this. So one end is wide. I don't know how, it's like 3/16 of an inch. It's not quite a 1/4 inch, but pretty hefty. And this other side has the sliding angles there. And that's the side I want. And it just slides right up underneath there. I'm going about halfway, and I'm back tacking, and I'm just leaving that hump jumper in there. And then I'm going to slide it out. I'm going to pull my pin, back tack the rest of the way back across. So I kind of did it like this. I back tacked 1/2, sewed the rest of the way, and then back tacked and went across. Sometimes when you're going backwards, it's hard to keep a straight stitch, so I just find it a little easier that way. Now on this handle, it's started to slip out there, so I am going to just tuck it up underneath, get it where I need it before I stitch it. Use my hump jumper again. That is so slick. Whoops. Oh, and I just broke a needle. But I didn't break it on a pin. I just kind of got to pushing a little too hard and snapped that. So let's change that out real quick. Hold on a second, I gotta find one. So if you're ever stitching on heavy stuff, thick stuff, and you find that your thread keeps breaking, you probably don't have a big enough needle in, because the eye of the needle and the shaft down the front of the needle protect the thread. And so if it consistently breaks, like you're doing a project, you're sewing along, and it breaks 2-3 times, that tells you that your needle's not big enough. Right there, it's having a hard time on that one spot. Interesting that it didn't do it until our 4th strap. And I have come back to where I started. So I'm going to stitch right over the top of it, probably for about a 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to back tack. Got all kinds of threads going here. There we go. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to go back and I'm going to stitch around that top edge. This time I'm going to do it from the outside because I can see just fine. I'm going to start on the side again, a side seam. Most people don't notice side seams very much, and so it's a good place to start. I moved the top of my fabric so that I could fit it right in that groove on my foot, and then I moved the needle over a little bit. So I'm probably sewing at about 1/8 of an inch from that upper edge. Okay, now this time I'm going to need that hump jumper again. I'm going to pull my clips out. I'm going to smooth out my fabric because I had a little bit of a wrinkle. Oh, actually, I might not even need the hump jumper. I'm still going to back tack all the way across it. So because I only had 1 layer of strapping, I didn't need the hump jumper. Where on the bottom, because it was folded, I had 2 layers. When I stop, I try to stop with the needle down so that it doesn't move on me. Did the whole thing backwards there and started going off, so I had to quick correction. Okay, so now I'm coming right back around to the beginning. I'm going to clip these threads and get those original ones out of the way. I'm going to go over the top of where I started and then back tack. Okay, we have one more thing to do, and I'm going to show you one of these and then let you do the other 3 on your own because they're really, really simple. Okay, so this is, sometimes it's called the barn door when you do the whole square. What I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to mark the sides of my handle when where they lay underneath the fabric here. So I have this marked here, and then I have that original marking. So right here down the side and right here down the side. And then I'm going to take my friction pen and I'm going to mark it straight across from corner to corner. And that was a pretty sloppy line. So what I'm going to do is pull out my ruler and mark that going across. And if I free-handed it and it turned out ugly, I would just take my iron, heat it, make it go away, and then do it again. So if you can do this correctly, and sometimes I can, half the time I can't, the barn door is when you're basically going to sew and create the X, but you can do it without stopping. And I would recommend just looking it up. It's the easiest way to tell you to do it. Or if you want, sew the sides, do the X. The more stitching you have in this spot, the better. I'm gonna put my needle back in the middle. When I stitch, now you know I drew those lines. I need to make sure that I'm stitching on the handle. So I have to make sure that wherever I drew those, it's on the handle. If I'm not sewing through the handle, there's no point in doing this. And then I'm just going to sew the X. When I get to the other side, I'm gonna stop while I'm still on the handle, go down the other side. I'm going to flip this around, sew across again, and I am going to, I need to go down the side. So I'm going across the top. I'm going to go down the side again, so that side's going to end up with 2, but my purpose in doing that is I want to make sure I go across the bottom. If there's a weak spot in this bag, it's going to be the handles, because they're going to bear the weight right at this point. So the more stitching we do, the better. Okay, let me give this a quick iron, see if this is warm enough to erase. And there we go. So I have sewn basically the entire square plus gone across it with the X so that it makes it nice and strong. And then once that's done, everything lays down nice and flat. And so I would do that on all 4 of those little spots. And so I was thinking as I was sewing this that I didn't give you the name of the bag, and actually I don't even have the cover sheet for it, so I can't tell you the name of it, but I can tell you it's by Moda and Ruby Star Society. So if you go on their probably Ruby Star Society website, look for free patterns, and then you're going to find this cute little bag. And thank you for sewing along with me, and I hope you enjoy making your little grocery bags. You can see the handle still ended up pretty long. Glad I cut some of that off. And great size, even if it was like a beach bag, or you can make whatever size you want. And so don't feel like you're restricted just to this 19 by 18. You can make it bigger, you can make it smaller, and just have fun with it. And thank you for sewing along with me. And remember, get creative at Nana's. Have a great day.